Hello everyone. So we'll talk now about the Institution Review Board or the IRB approval, as well as the research proposal and research methodology. So the Institution Review Board is like a research contract. So why do we need it exactly? For several reasons. We need it to protect welfare, rights, and privacy of included participants. So when you're conducting a research project that includes human participants, you want to make sure you're doing it in an ethical manner. So if you do a cross-section study or a survey based, you're going to be obtaining responses from several people, and you want to do it in an ethical manner. And also when you're doing a retrospective study, you're collecting medical records, so you're collecting data from people who went to the same hospital that you're collecting the data from, and those people want their data to be anonymous, so you're maintaining that privacy of patients. It's also to protect researchers' ideas and ongoing projects. So in an ideal world, if researcher A and researcher B had the same idea, but researcher A written a proposal and submitted for IRB approval, the IRB committee, if they receive a similar idea or the same idea, they would reject that idea for IRB, since it is already done by someone else. So here's an example of an IRB approval from one of my early projects. So it looks like this. However, you need to understand that it might look different. However, you would need the approval stamp. So I think the first question that will be on your mind is, okay, where can I obtain an IRB approval? So the IRB committee, Institution Review Board Committee, so every hospital or medical college, almost virtually everywhere in the world, should have an IRB committee. An IRB committee is usually a group of researchers, consultants, and whatnot, who will take your research project or proposal and they will assess if it's ethical or not. Most of the study that students or healthcare workers is usually really easy to obtain an IRB approval. So how long does it take to get an IRB approval? So it really ranges based on the study design and the IRB committee. Usually it lasts between 1 month to 3 months, even up to 6 months. For example, if you're doing a cross-sectional and retrospective study, it may take a few months. However, if you're doing a prospective and an RCT study, it may take even longer than that, since there's more restrictions, since you're adding something new rather than just collecting data. So should everyone from the same institution as the IRB committee? So let's say you want to work with a co-author from a different city, from a different hospital or university. They don't necessarily have to be from the same institution. However, most IRB committees, they want a research supervisor, whether a consultant or a faculty member, from the same institution. So for me, I'm from a university in Jeddah, and I managed to get an IRB approval from King Saud University in Riyadh. And I was able to do that because the research supervisor was already affiliated with King Saud University, hence why I managed to do that. You should always ask your research supervisor or the IRB committee. Sometimes they would have some requirements to register in their website or something if you want to add a co-author from a different institution. So what do you do if you do not get an IRB approval? You need to understand that most projects get an IRB approval. If you do not, it means this research idea might not be ethical in the first place, or that there is something that they do not agree with, or they do not want that data to be collected, which is completely okay. You can either just submit for another IRB committee if possible, or you can change your study idea a little bit. So there are some study designs that do not require an IRB approval to begin with. So systematic reviews and meta-analysis, they do not require an IRB approval. However, typically you would need to register your study idea in something called Prospero, and this is like an international registry where any systematic reviews idea would be registered there in order to protect your idea, that it's your idea as a researcher. Also, case reports. If you're doing a case report, you don't need to have an IRB. You just need the patient permission and consent. So when you have a case report, you as a student or your consultant, your research supervisor, would ask the patient that we want to write a case report and we want to publish it, and everything is going to be anonymous, but we are informing you to obtain your permission regarding the publication. So case series is really, it's between two sides. So it really varies based on the institution. Some of them, they require an IRB approval if you have 10 or 20 patients, with the cutoff value ranging between 14 to 16 patients. So sometimes you would write a case series and you would obtain the permission from the patient and you don't need an IRB. And sometimes if it's more than a specific number, so for example 20, then you need to submit for an IRB approval. So the research proposal. The research proposal is the same as an IRB form. So where can you find an IRB or research proposal? So I think a practical manner is better. So let's say for our university, let's look up so for our university, there's the departments, the research unit. You go down here to forms. And here you would find research forms. So this is the research proposal form. You can download it. Let's add it here in the IRB forms. So there are several forms. There's the research proposal form, and let's add, for example, the cross-sectional form, so you can be familiar with it. No need for the other things. Okay. So let's go to the forms. So here you can find the research proposal form or the IRB form. Here's an example here. We'll go over it in a minute. So I showed you where you can find the forms. So what are the components of research proposal? Let's go over them. So you don't need to fill anything here. This is just for the IRB committee. You can write the title of your paper here, the initial paper. It's really preferable that you use the same title for the publication and for the IRB. Here you would write what is the type of your project. Is it chart review? So this is a retrospective study. Is it quantitative research that uses number? This is for cross-sectional. Qualitative, as we talked about before, there is a PhD and master project if you're a PhD or a master candidate. Diagnostic laboratory, this is mostly, diagnostic is a clinical study design, however, it's mostly done by seniors. So laboratory and human therapeutic basic science, as we mentioned before. So starting date, you can mention upon approval of IRB. So let's just write it here. Duration, typically 12 months, even if you're gonna do it in less. Total fund, most projects by students, they don't require any funding, so you can just mention non-applicable. For the BI, you would mention the name of the BI, their telephone, their mobile, affiliation and address, title and position, email. Then here you would arrange the co-investigators or co-authors for the co-authors that you have suggested or you agreed on the authorship positions. The first author, second author, third author, and so on. The title, position, the department, and their signature. Then the main author signature. The background, here you would do a literature review and you would write a background or like an introduction section. I would highly recommend that whatever you write here should be the introduction section. Not necessarily, sometimes you would just write anything for the literature review. You need to understand that IRB committees, they do not check for plagiarism. So some researchers, they would just copy paste the introduction of an already published study and they would just add their own aim. However, I think it's really good to write in your own to really develop your writing skills. Or even you can use the background here for the introduction section of your manuscript. So the aim of the study, so what are you trying to achieve? This is the main question. Specific objective, you can mention whatever you're trying to achieve with your research project. Secondary objective are not always necessary. So materials, here you want to describe your method section. Study area and setting. So exactly where are you doing it? Are you doing it in your own university, in the hospital, in a specific hospital? You would write down the name of the institution and talk a little bit about it. Study subject, so you want to talk about your inclusion and exclusion criteria. exclusion criteria might not always be applicable, but you want to ask, okay, for inclusion criteria, you would mention, based on our previous study idea, you would just mention, okay, I'm going to include only medical students, and add the justification for why you're doing this, or you can also add interns and medical students. Study design, the things that we mentioned, cross-sectional, case control. I did not talk about this. Case control is simply about comparison between people who had a specific intervention or condition and people who did not with the same baseline characteristic. Intervention study, you would mention this as well. And for the sample size, we'll talk about it in a minute. Sampling technique, if it's most times it's either consecutive sampling technique or a convenience sampling technique. So convenience, for example, you're sending the survey and whoever fills it. And for a consecutive, meaning you're including all the population. If you have, for example, not so many participants. So the data collection methods, instrument and measurement. So are you using a questionnaire or are you using a data collection sheet? And we'll talk about them later as well. And how did you came up to with them as well. Data management analysis. So you can mention here what is the statistical package that you will use. Discuss this with your research supervisor. Most times we have the same paragraph. For example, you're using the SPSS or the JUMP software. So the references, you would add the references you use in the background or the introduction. Ethical consideration, you need to understand, you need to mention that it's going to be anonymous and that the participation is voluntary, and you're maintaining the confidentiality and privacy of the participants. Here you can have a work plan. So this is just an example from one institution. The main thing that they usually have is the research question, the study design, the sample size, inclusion criteria, things like this to understand. So we already mentioned all of those. So sample size calculation. I usually use just the raw soft sample size calculator. So let me show you. Okay. Unfortunately, it's not working. Unfortunately, the raw soft samples isn't working. However, you can look up whatever sample size calculator and you will find several of them. Usually you want to know the population, which is the total number of participants. Then you want to know the margin of confidence interval, which is usually 5%, 5 to 10%, I believe. And then you want to know what is your sample size or your response rate. So for the sample size and response rate are two different things. But for the sample size, if you, for example, you have 10,000 participants, you can't collect the data from each and every one. So usually with the sample size calculator will tell you need 350 to 400 participants. So those kind, if you collect this amount of participants, it's enough to be to really give you the same conclusion as if you collected 1,000. Okay. So research proposal also include the research methodology. This is again a fancy way of saying what is your plan for your research and what you're going exactly to do. So a research question or hypothesis, a research question should basically, what are you trying to answer? So it's not the core of your research, it is the entire, it is your entire research. So you ask a question, okay, what do a medical student think about research? This is your research question. Then you do an entire study in order to answer this question. So how to produce a good research question? Try to be as specific as you can. Once you are specific, it really makes it really easier by the end of the project to organize your results and to organize your manuscript. I have worked in a project where I wasn't specific initially and it made it really difficult to finalize that project. But every time you're specific with your research question, the more effective and efficient it will be. So the Pico format is really, really helpful, which is who are your population. So for example, here we can say medical students. Then for the intervention, this might not always be applicable. So for example, in observational study, in our idea that I mentioned before, we don't have an intervention to be exact. Then comparison, again, this might not always be applicable in interventional study. For the outcomes, it's also very important. So let's say your research question or hypothesis that medical students struggle with research. So your population is medical students, and your outcomes that they struggle with it and they face some kind of barrier or adversity. So this is it for the IRB approval. I hope this is clear. And before I finish, I want to show you this one thing. So in cross-sectional study, some IRB committees, they will show you in this form. You would write the study title, the BI, and the study number once you obtain the IRB approval. Then you would write, fill up those red, so for example, the name of the BI, the place, the main purpose, etc. Then you would use it with your survey when you're distributing your survey. So I hope this is clear, and best of luck.